Welcome, and thank you for joining me for tonight's story, a slow, gentle journey through the life of one of the most famous women of the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine. But before we begin, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to The Boring Historian, where we take history at a quieter pace, letting the stories breathe, and giving you the chance to drift away into the past without the rush of battles and the noise of modern life. If you're watching right now, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Perhaps you're curled up under a blanket late at night. Perhaps you're listening in the early morning before the day begins. Or maybe you've just let this play in the background to lull you into sleep. Our story begins in the gentle warmth of the French southwest. In the year 1122, when Eleanor was born into one of the most powerful noble families in Europe, she came into the world not in the bustle of Paris or the royal courts of the north, but in the softer landscapes of Aquitaine, a region known for its vineyards, rolling hills, and a culture shaped by both French and Occitan traditions. Her father, William X, was Duke of Aquitaine, a ruler of vast lands stretching from the Loire River to the Pyrenees. Her mother, Anna de Chatellero, died when Eleanor was young, leaving her and her siblings in the care of their father. Eleanor's childhood was unusual for a girl of the 12th century. The courts of Aquitaine were lively places, steeped in the traditions of chivalry and poetry. Troubadours performed songs of courtly love, and noble guests from across Europe passed through, bringing tales of distant lands. Though she was educated in reading, music, and religion, as expected of a noblewoman, she was also exposed to political discussions and the subtle art of diplomacy. In 1137, when Eleanor was still a teenager, her father died unexpectedly while on pilgrimage. His passing left her as the sole heiress to Aquitaine's vast lands, making her one of the most desirable marriage prospects in Europe. Almost immediately, political forces began to move. The King of France saw an opportunity to unite Aquitaine with the French crown through marriage to his son, Louis. That summer, Eleanor was wed to Louis, soon to become King Louis VII of France. Overnight, she went from Duchess to Queen, a shift that would change her life forever. But the court of Paris was not the sunlit Aquitaine she had known. It was colder, more rigid, and bound by the heavy expectations of medieval queenship. Eleanor's marriage to Louis would be the beginning of a long, often difficult journey across the political and cultural landscapes of medieval Europe, a journey that would take her from France to the Crusader states, from England to the farthest corners of her own duchy. When people imagine Eleanor of Aquitaine's youth, they often picture her surrounded by gardens, music, and endless luxury, a golden-haired princess wandering through sunlit courtyards while troubadours sang for her. And while such scenes were not entirely impossible, the truth was far more grounded and, in many ways, far more ordinary. The ducal palaces of Aquitaine were not fairy tale castles. They were large stone fortresses with draughty halls, narrow windows, and a constant battle against the damp. Fires burned in great hearths, but the warmth rarely reached the far corners of the rooms. On cold mornings, Eleanor likely woke to the sound of servants stoking the embers, the smell of smoke and wood ash mingling with the faint scent of rushes strewn across the floor. Her education was shaped by both practicality and status. She learned to read Latin prayers, to manage the accounts of an estate, to oversee the storage and distribution of food, and to maintain the complex etiquette of a noble court. These skills were not decorative. They were essential to running a vast domain. Songs and poetry filled the air, but so did the endless negotiations of land, alliances, and tribute. As a child, Eleanor would have been aware of her position, the daughter of a duke, heiress to one of the richest territories in Europe, but that awareness came with lessons in caution. The political landscape of 12th century France was a web of loyalties and rivalries. Any misstep could invite dangerous attention. The myth paints her childhood as carefree. The reality is that even as a young girl, Eleanor's life was framed by duty. Every gesture at court, every word in conversation, was a subtle exercise in diplomacy. She was not simply being raised, she was being prepared. Prepared to be a duchess, prepared to be a queen, prepared to survive. By her mid-teens, Eleanor of Aquitaine was already at the center of one of the most influential courts in Europe. To outsiders, this might have seemed dazzling rich fabrics from the east, gold and silver goblets on the tables, and long feasts filled with music and laughter. But daily life in such a court moved at a pace far slower and far more repetitive than the pageantry suggested. Mornings began with ceremony. Eleanor would rise to the sound of bells from the chapel, dress with the help of attendants, and step into cold stone corridors that smelled faintly of beeswax and damp linen. The great hall might be bustling with preparations for the day, but much of that activity was the work of servants. For a duchess, the role was often to watch, to receive, to be present, rather than to act directly. Courtly splendor was largely about formality. Audiences with vassals, hearing petitions, and mediating disputes could take hours, and most of it was spoken in the same measured, careful language. A wrong word could offend. A careless promise could commit her lands to unwanted obligations. So each conversation was a slow negotiation. Feasts, too, were less about pleasure than politics. Long tables groaned with roasted meats and spiced dishes, but eating was done with decorum, conversation kept within the bounds of courtesy. Laughter might ripple through the hall now and then, but more often it was the steady murmur of voices, the scraping of knives, the clink of cups. In between these formalities came stretches of stillness. A duchess did not wander freely beyond the castle walls without purpose. Instead, she might spend afternoons listening to poetry, working on embroidery, or walking in enclosed gardens. It was a life contained, rich in appearances, yet bound by endless repetition. From the outside, Eleanor's court seemed like the heart of excitement and culture, but from within it could feel like a long, unbroken performance, in which every gesture was calculated and every hour filled with duties that, for all their elegance, were often quietly monotonous. In 1137, Eleanor's life shifted dramatically. At just 15, she was married to Louis, heir to the French throne. The union was not born of romance, nor even of personal choice. It was arranged swiftly after the sudden death of her father, William Becht, and it bound her vast and wealthy duchy of Aquitaine to the royal Capetian line. To those watching, it was a triumph of political strategy. To Eleanor it was a step into a far more rigid and unfamiliar world. Louis himself was only a few years older, but unlike Eleanor, he had been raised for the cloister before the unexpected death of his elder brother had placed the crown in his future. He was deeply pious, almost monastic in his outlook, and more comfortable in the quiet of prayer than in the bustle of courtly life. Eleanor, with her Aquitanian upbringing full of music, poetry, and the color of southern France, must have felt the contrast immediately. Their marriage began under the watchful eyes of clerics and courtiers, where affection was secondary to duty. The royal court in Paris was colder in temperature and in spirit than the warm halls of Poitiers. Stone walls here seemed less like a backdrop for celebration and more like a barrier, keeping the world out and those within bound to their roles. Daily interactions between the young couple were formal, shaped by ritual and the expectations of the crown. While they traveled together, hunting or attending ceremonies, Louis's priorities remained focused on faith and governance. Eleanor, intelligent and politically aware, was not content to be merely decorative, but even her sharp insights into diplomacy and strategy were often set aside by advisors who valued obedience over initiative. In public, they were the model of royal partnership, united, dignified, and serene. In private, the distance between them grew. It was not open hostility, but a slow, quiet recognition that theirs was a bond forged in necessity rather than shared passion. For Eleanor, it was the first real test of a life that would be shaped again and again by alliances of convenience, where her own desires were rarely the deciding factor. In 1147, Eleanor's life was swept into one of the most ambitious and punishing ventures of the age, the Second Crusade. What began as a solemn call to arms from the church became a grinding ordeal that would test her endurance and alter her relationship with Louis beyond repair. She accompanied the French army not merely as queen but as a political figurehead, bringing with her a large contingent from Aquitaine. The journey promised piety, glory, and the defense of Christendom. Instead, it delivered hardship on a scale few could have imagined. From the start, the expedition was plagued by poor planning. The army moved slowly, burdened by baggage trains and lacking reliable supply routes. Roads turned to mud beneath the spring rains, and soldiers trudged for miles on end, their boots wearing thin. Food was scarce. When provisions could be found, they were often stale or spoiled. Many drank from streams fouled by animal waste, leading to sickness that spread quickly among the ranks. Eleanor, accustomed to the comforts of court, now faced life in a tent pitched on stony ground, the nights made colder by biting winds. Dust and flies clung to everything during the day. The smoke of campfires carried the bitter scent of damp wood. She watched as soldiers, both knights and commoners, grew gaunt and weary, their morale eroding with each passing week. The romantic notion of a holy mission gave way to the slow realization that the crusade was poorly led and riven by internal disputes. Louis relied heavily on religious advisors, whose decisions often ignored the practical needs of an army in hostile territory. Strategic blunders, including the ill-fated march across the rugged terrain of Asia Minor, cost lives and sapped the strength of the force. For Eleanor, the crusade also revealed the deep fissures in her marriage. The hardships stripped away ceremony, leaving their differences starkly exposed. Her boldness in council, offering suggestions, questioning plans, was met with resistance, and at times, resentment. By the time they reached the wars of Damascus, the once lofty purpose of their journey had been reduced to a weary sense of obligation. The campaign ended without victory, its failure a bitter reminder that devotion alone could not overcome poor leadership and fractured alliances. For Eleanor, it marked the beginning of a decisive turn in her life, planting the seeds for the independence she would soon claim. The journey back from the Holy Land was no triumphant homecoming. The sea voyage to Europe was long and unpredictable, the decks crowded with weary men and women eager to see familiar shores. The smell of salt water mixed with the staleness of damp provisions. Gulls circled above, their cries sharp in the wind, while the ship's timbers groaned with every shift of the waves. For Eleanor, the physical return to France was paired with the quiet knowledge that her marriage to Louis VII had been irrevocably altered. On the road to the east, she had been a queen beside her king. On the way home, she felt more like a passenger, her presence tolerated but her voice unwelcome. Louis had grown more devout, more withdrawn, and far less inclined to consult her on matters of governance or strategy. Even in the shared quarters of their lodgings along the route, conversation was sparse, the air heavy with unspoken grievances. The political alliance that had bound them, the union of the French crown with the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, still mattered to the nobility. But its personal foundation had crumbled. They had 2 daughters, yet no son, and in the politics of the 12th century, that absence weighed heavily. Court whispers spoke of God's judgment, while others pointed to incompatibility between the pious, cautious king and his spirited, independent queen. By 1152, the distance between them was no longer only emotional but legal. In March of that year, the marriage was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, a distant blood relation, a reason often invoked when more personal causes were best left unspoken. The separation was swift and formal, leaving Eleanor free once more, her titles and lands restored entirely to her control. Within weeks she would make a decision that startled all of Europe, to remarry not to another quiet noble but to a young and ambitious man destined to reshape her life and the politics of the continent. Henry Plant. When Eleanor left Louis VII's court, she did not linger in political limbo. Her lands, Aquitaine, Poitou, and their rich revenues, made her one of the most desirable matches in Europe. Nobles whispered her name as both an opportunity and a danger. Suitors were quick to act, knowing that control of her territories meant more than wealth. It meant influence over the southwestern edge of France and the sea routes to Spain. Only weeks after her annulment, Eleanor made her choice. She married Henry Plantagenet, the Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, a man 10 years her junior but already a force in European politics. Henry was bold, restless, and ruthlessly ambitious. Their marriage joined her domains with his northern holdings, creating a swath of territory that rivaled, and in some ways overshadowed, the royal lands of France. It was a union that shifted the balance of power almost overnight. For Eleanor, this was no simple leap into romance. It was a calculated move, a way to maintain her independence and strengthen her position in a political landscape where womenist authority was often tethered to their husbands. Henry's ambitions suited her own, at least in the early years. Together they could envision a realm that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, a network of castles, markets, and ports that would make them formidable against any rival, even the French crown. Yet, the gamble was clear. Henry's drive for control could easily clash with her own will. In him she saw both a partner and a potential adversary. The first years of their marriage brimmed with energy and expansion. But beneath the surface, the seeds of future power struggles had already been sown. Eleanor's life had entered a new chapter, one that promised both triumph and deep unrest. Becoming Queen of England did not mean Eleanor settled into a single grand palace, surrounded by velvet and gold. The reality was far less stationary, and far less romantic. Henry's vast territories, often called the Angevin Empire, stretched across England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. This meant that the royal court was not fixed. It was a moving body, traveling from one seat of power to another, carrying with it the documents, treasuries, and officials necessary to keep the realm functioning. Eleanor's life became a blur of journeys, cold crossings of the Channel, bone-jarring rides along muddy roads, and weeks spent in drafty castles that smelled of smoke and damp stone. At times, she and Henry traveled together, holding court in one region before moving on to the next, but more often their duties kept them apart. Henry's endless campaigns and administrative tours took him far from her side, while Eleanor spent long stretches in her own territories, overseeing her lands and acting as queen. Eleanor was no idle figurehead. She acted as regent in Henry's absence, making decisions on taxation, trade, and justice. Petitions came to her table. Disputes were brought to her chambers. In Aquitaine, she worked to keep the fractious local lords loyal, sometimes with diplomacy, sometimes with firm pressure. Her governance was steady, but the constant motion of court life left little room for comfort or personal peace. The grandeur of queenship was real enough in ceremony, jeweled crowns, solemn processions, feasts held in her honor, yet the daily experience was one of labor and restlessness. Eleanor had gained a throne, but she had also taken on the ceaseless weight of keeping an empire bound together, even as the miles stretched between her and her husband. Eleanor's role as a mother was as demanding as her role as a queen, yet far from the gentle image of maternal life that modern minds might imagine. In the Middle Ages, childbirth itself was dangerous. Eleanor endured it many times, at least 10, according to most records, each birth a moment balanced between hope and the very real threat of death. There were no trained doctors at her bedside, only midwives, herbal remedies, and the prayers of those nearby. Every delivery brought the risk of infection, fever, or loss. Once a child was born, survival was never guaranteed. Even in royal households, illness swept through nurseries with alarming speed. Fever, measles, or a sudden cough could carry away a child before the court physician had time to arrive. Eleanor knew this reality intimately, and the shadow of loss was never far from her thoughts. Her position meant her children were rarely just her own. Princes and princesses were political assets, bound to marriages and alliances before they could even walk. As soon as they were weaned, many were sent to foster households or distant courts to be raised among those they would one day rule or marry. Eleanor could not keep her family close, even if she had wished to, and yet, she maintained influence. Through letters and carefully chosen messengers, she offered guidance and ensured her children's positions were strengthened. It was a constant balancing act, nurturing their bond as a mother, while preparing them to be tools of power in a turbulent political world. In Eleanor's life, love and duty were never separate, and motherhood was as much about survival, hers and theirs, as it was about affection. Being queen was not a matter of idle luxury for Eleanor. It was an endless web of responsibilities, most of them thankless. Medieval courts were never still. A restless tide of petitioners, envoys, clergy, and nobles arrived daily, each with requests, demands, or veiled threats. As queen, Eleanor had to listen, decide, and negotiate, often on matters that could decide the fate of entire towns or influence wars abroad. This constant stream of decision-making left little time for personal rest. Every word spoken in the Great Hall could echo for years in the politics of Europe. A promise made too quickly could bind a kingdom. A refusal could turn an ally into an enemy. Eleanor's court was not only a seat of power, but also a theater of performance. Every gesture, every expression had to be measured. Intrigue swirled in every corner. Rival nobles whispered in corridors. Clerics sought influence in spiritual matters that had very real political consequences, and ambassadors carried tales between kingdoms. Eleanor was at the center of this storm, managing disputes between feuding barons, smoothing over her husband Henry's frequent conflicts, and keeping the ever-fractured Angevin Empire from splintering further. The exhaustion was not just mental but physical. Court travel was constant, the royal household moving between palaces and fortresses across England and France to show presence, maintain loyalty, and enforce authority. Days were long, the weight of her gown heavy, the rooms draughty, and the conversations endless. For all the splendor painted in later romantic stories, the reality was that Eleanor's political life was an unceasing strain, a role she could never truly set down. In the later years of Eleanor's life with Henry, the political turbulence of her world moved closer to home, into her own family. The Plantagenet brood was large, ambitious, and fiercely independent. Her sons, particularly the older ones, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, grew restless under their father's unyielding control. They were princes in name, but in practice, they had little real authority. It was a dangerous situation. In the Middle Ages, a prince without lands or power was a prince seeking them elsewhere, and this meant alliances outside the family. Whispers began, quiet promises exchanged with the King of France and discontented nobles. Eleanor, perhaps seeing herself in their ambition, is believed to have lent her ear to her son's grievances. Whether she actively encouraged rebellion or merely failed to discourage it has been debated for centuries. But, in 1173, the simmering tensions boiled over into open revolt. The rebellion was both a political crisis and a personal heartbreak. Sons stood against father, armies marched, castles were besieged. Eleanor herself was captured while traveling, accused of aiding the uprising. For a queen of her stature, the humiliation was profound, the betrayal was layered. Husband against wife, father against sons, brothers against each other. In the intricate tapestry of medieval politics, family bonds could be as fragile as treaties. The revolt was eventually crushed, but its scars ran deep, both in the Angevin Empire and within the royal family itself. After the rebellion failed, Henry acted swiftly and without sentiment. Eleanor, once his partner in power, was now a liability. She was placed under guard, not in the depths of a dungeon, but in the restrained comfort of a noblewoman's confinement. For the next 16 years, her life was not her own. Her imprisonment was a peculiar kind of limbo. She lived in royal residences and strongholds, Salisbury, Winchester, and elsewhere, but she moved only at her husband's will, always watched, her letters and visitors controlled. She was still a queen, but without the freedom to rule, to travel, or even to see most of her children. The political stage that had once been hers to command was reduced to the small, repetitive circle of her daily life. Days blurred into one another. There were no grand councils, no journeys across Europe, no riding out at the head of a courtly procession. Instead, there were quiet hours by the fire, embroidery, reading when books were available, and long silences. Seasons changed, but her routine did not. The world beyond her guarded walls moved on. Wars fought, treaties signed, children grown, and she remained apart from it all. This was a punishment of patience, a slow erosion of influence and momentum. For Eleanor, who had once been at the center of power, the monotony must have been the hardest burden of all. When Henry II died in 1189, the chains of Eleanor's long confinement fell away almost overnight. Richard, now King of England, released her at once, restoring her titles, lands, and authority. The woman who had been silent and sidelined for more than a decade returned to public life with remarkable energy. Despite her age, she was now well into her 60s, a venerable figure in a world where few reached such years. Her return was not a ceremonial gesture, it was a practical necessity. Richard trusted her implicitly to act in his stead. While he prepared for the Third Crusade, Eleanor traveled across England and the continent, securing loyalty from nobles, raising funds, and negotiating delicate agreements. She moved through the realm with quiet authority, her presence a reminder of both continuity and stability. Age had slowed her body, but not her mind. She navigated court politics with care, steering factions away from conflict, calming unrest, and protecting the fragile balance of the kingdom. In these years, she was less the vibrant, visible duchess of her youth, and more the steady matriarch, respected, listened to, and needed. Though her life had shifted from the passionate energy of youth to the measured steps of age, she remained an enduring figure of power. Freedom had returned to her late, but she used it with the precision and patience learned through long years of waiting. By the time Richard had been crowned and Eleanor's authority as his regent was secured, her role began to settle into something both quieter and, in many ways, more enduring. She was now Dowager Queen of England, a title that carried no formal crown, yet immense influence. In this role, her primary tools were no longer armies or processions, but letters, conversations, and a network of trusted messengers who crisscrossed the kingdoms on her behalf. Eleanor spent long hours at her writing table, not in the hurried, chaotic manner of a secretary, but in the slow, deliberate rhythm of medieval diplomacy. Quills were trimmed and ink mixed fresh each morning. Sheets of parchment, smoothed and cut to size, lay ready. Her correspondence spanned not only England and Aquitaine, but the courts of Castile, Navarre, and the papacy. She wrote to her sons with a mixture of firmness and warmth, to churchmen with the careful deference required, and to foreign rulers with the strategic courtesy that could open doors or close them entirely. Each letter was more than words. It was an extension of her presence. In a world where travel was slow and news even slower, a sealed letter from Eleanor of Aquitaine carried weight before it was even read. She often dictated drafts to scribes, reviewing every phrase to ensure the tone struck the right balance, persuasive without pleading, authoritative without arrogance. Negotiations, too, became her domain. She acted as intermediary in disputes between her sons, soothed ruffled alliances, and secured advantageous marriages for her grandchildren. These were delicate, often invisible labors, conducted not in the glare of court ceremony, but in the quiet exchanges of messengers, the discreet meetings in private chambers, and the subtle art of making each party feel they had gained something. Though she no longer rode at the head of processions or traveled as ceaselessly as before, her mind remained in constant motion. Even in her later years, she could recall past treaties, the genealogies of rival houses, and the shifting allegiances that defined Europe's fragile peace. Her influence was like a steady current beneath the surface of royal politics, not always visible but always present, guiding events toward outcomes she deemed best for her family and her lands. In the role of Dowager Queen, Eleanor had finally found a space where her age was an asset rather than a limitation. She was no longer a young duchess bound by expectation, nor a queen consort overshadowed by a husband's rule. She was the elder stateswoman, the voice others turned to when tempers ran high or threats loomed. And in the flickering candlelight of her writing chamber, surrounded by scrolls and seals, she shaped the fate of kingdoms one letter at a time. In the later chapters of her life, Eleanor of Aquitaine's influence was often measured not in battles won or castles held, but in marriages made, matches that could bind kingdoms together or, if neglected, leave them vulnerable. In the medieval world, a royal marriage was never just a union between two individuals. It was a contract of immense political weight, often more important than any treaty signed on parchment, and Eleanor, with decades of experience navigating the labyrinth of European politics, was uniquely skilled at making these unions happen. But arranging such marriages was no matter of simply choosing a name and sending an invitation. It was a slow, intricate dance that could take years to bring to conclusion. First came the inquiries, discreet messengers sent to gauge the interest of foreign courts, to discover whether the proposed match would be met with enthusiasm, reluctance, or outright refusal. Then came the negotiations, the dowry, the inheritance rights, the lands to be secured, the titles to be shared. Every detail had to be examined from all sides, for a single overlooked clause could cause decades of unrest. For Eleanor, these arrangements often required her to leave the comfort of her own halls and take to the road once more. In her later years, travel was no longer the swift, spirited adventure it had been in her youth. The roads were the same, rutted in places, muddy in rain, dusty in summer, but her body felt the strain more keenly now. She moved with a retinue for safety and dignity. Yet even the most careful journey could not escape the discomforts. Damp bedchambers in roadside manors, unpredictable weather, and the ever-present delays of medieval travel. Still, the work was too important to leave entirely in the hands of others. A meeting conducted face-to-face could do more than a dozen letters, and Eleanor knew the value of her personal presence. She could read a ruler's mood in a glance, detect hesitation in a tone, and steer the conversation toward more favorable ground with a well-timed story or a subtle reminder of shared history. She had, after all, been both a French queen and an English queen, and few in Europe could match her understanding of the power and fragility of royal alliances. She arranged matches for her grandchildren, seeking to place them in courts where they would not only be secure but also strengthen the Plantagenet position. One of her most notable journeys came when she personally escorted her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, across the Pyrenees and through France to marry the future King Louis VIII. This was no mere formality. Eleanor's presence ensured the dignity of the bride's arrival, projected the authority of the Plantagenet name, and cemented the sense of shared purpose between two great dynasties. Every such mission left her both weary and quietly triumphant. She understood that these marriages would outlast her own life, shaping the destinies of entire kingdoms long after she was gone. It was work that rarely earned the loud applause of court or the dramatic flourish of a battlefield victory. But Eleanor, seasoned by decades of rule, recognized its deeper importance. Peace, after all, was often maintained not by swords but by the bonds of family, and it was those bonds she spent her final years weaving, stitch by careful stitch, across the patchwork of medieval Europe. Even amid the weight of political responsibilities, military campaigns, and endless diplomacy, Eleanor of Aquitaine never forgot the world of art, music, and storytelling, the realm that had shaped her youth and, in many ways, defined her legacy. Long before she was remembered as a matriarch of kings, she had been the spirited Duchess of Aquitaine, presiding over one of the most vibrant courts in Europe. Aquitaine was not merely a political territory. It was a cultural heartland, renowned for its refinement, its lyrical language, and its flourishing of troubadour poetry. In her younger days, Eleanor had been surrounded by men and women who believed that words could carry as much power as weapons. Troubadours, poet-musicians who sang of love, chivalry, and human folly, found a generous welcome in her court. These were not idle entertainers, they were the cultural voice of their time, shaping ideals of romance and honor that would ripple through European literature for centuries. Eleanor's patronage gave them the stability and prestige they needed to refine their art, and in turn, they gave her court an atmosphere of refinement and imagination that set it apart from the harsher, more utilitarian halls of many other rulers. The themes they celebrated, courtly love, loyalty, the moral testing of knights, often mirrored the political and personal ideals Eleanor herself cultivated. In a world where women were too often sidelined from public influence, the courtly love tradition elevated the role of the noble lady, casting her as the moral compass and source of inspiration for noble deeds. Whether or not Eleanor herself believed these ideals to be fully attainable in the rough realities of medieval politics, she recognized their soft power. A knight inspired by a lady's favor could be as loyal to her cause as one bound by oath or coin. Her influence as a cultural patron did not fade with age. Even after years of imprisonment under Henry II and the exhausting political duties of her later life, Eleanor maintained correspondence with poets and continued to surround herself with musicians and chroniclers when possible. Her support extended beyond Aquitaine, touching courts in England, France, and beyond. The stories, songs, and verses that thrived under her protection would later serve as the foundation for many later works in the European literary canon, echoes of her influence resonating in the romances of Détraz and indirectly in the Arthurian legends that captured the medieval imagination. It was in these cultural contributions that Eleanor's legacy softened, becoming something more enduring than the shifting boundaries of kingdoms or the fragile treaties she brokered. Castles could crumble, borders could change hands, but the verses born in her court and carried from hall to hall had a life of their own. They traveled farther than her armies, lasted longer than her reign, and in their way, spoke more truthfully about her vision for a world where beauty and wit could coexist with power. In the quiet hours of her later years, perhaps Eleanor thought of those long-ago evenings in Aquitaine, the flicker of torchlight, the soft notes of a lute, the measured rise and fall of a poet's voice. These moments, she must have known, were not mere decoration for the grandeur of court life, but seeds of a cultural flowering whose roots would stretch far beyond her own time. By the final years of her life, Eleanor of Aquitaine had carried more than most could bear: the burdens of 2 quinquages, the raising of many children, the rigors of diplomacy, and the scars of personal loss. Age, which she had long resisted through energy and willpower, now began to make itself known in a way she could no longer ignore. The woman who had once ridden for days across rugged landscapes now moved slowly, often requiring assistance to mount a horse or walk the length of a hall. In the medieval world, old age was not seen as a time of gentle retirement. There were no cushioned armchairs, no quiet hours spent with reliable medical care. Instead, ailments were endured, managed more through patience and prayer than through effective treatment. Medieval medicine moved at the speed of observation and guesswork, bound by ancient theories rather than modern science. Physicians of the time were guided by the humoral theory, the belief that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To restore balance, they prescribed purges, bleedings, and herbal infusions that could be as exhausting as the illness itself. For Eleanor, the treatments available would have been a curious mix of practical herbcraft and almost ritualistic remedies. A poultice of chamomile might be applied to soothe aching joints, while hot wine infused with rosemary could be offered for stiffness or fatigue. More elaborate measures might involve the chanting of prayers, the burning of incense, or the consultation of astrological charts to determine the most auspicious time for treatment. None of it could stop the slow weakening of her body, but it provided the reassurance for patient and physician alike that something was being done. Pain was a constant companion in old age. Arthritis might have stiffened her fingers, making it harder to hold a quill when she dictated letters. Her eyesight could have dimmed, making candlelight seem harsher and reading more tiring. Cold winters would have been particularly cruel, seeping into bones and lingering for days. Even so, Eleanor remained mentally sharp, her mind continuing to weigh matters of family, politics, and alliances, even when her body insisted on slower days. In a world without antibiotics, surgery as we know it, or effective pain relief beyond herbal sedatives, the best medicine was often simple rest, something Eleanor had rarely allowed herself in younger years. Now, in the quieter rhythms of Fontevraud Abbey, she would have been surrounded by the low murmur of nuns at prayer, the scent of beeswax candles, and the distant ringing of bells marking the hours. Here she could give herself over to the slower pace forced upon her by age, reflecting on the long arc of her life. Her decline was not dramatic but gradual, a soft ebbing away rather than a sudden collapse. This slow fading allowed her to set her affairs in order, to ensure her burial would be at Fontevraud alongside Henry and her son Richard, and to make peace with the legacy she would leave behind. In the quiet stillness of her later days, Eleanor's strength took on a new form, not the force of action and command, but the endurance to meet life's end with dignity, patience, and the calm acceptance that comes when one has truly lived. In the twilight of her life, Eleanor of Aquitaine found herself in the stone embrace of Fontevraud Abbey, a place of both seclusion and significance. Nestled in the quiet Loire Valley, the abbey was a world apart from the political courts, battlefields, and bustling cities that had shaped her earlier years. Its rhythm was governed not by the demands of kings and diplomats, but by the slow, steady cadence of prayer, work, and the seasons. By this time, Eleanor had lived nearly 8 decades, a staggering span in an age when many never saw their 40th year. Within Fontevraud's walls, she exchanged the grandeur of royal halls for the austere simplicity of the cloister. The cold limestone corridors echoed with the soft shuffle of nuns' sandals, the hushed tones of sung psalms, and the occasional tolling of a bell marking the canonical hours. These sounds became her companions, just as the cool, fragrant air of the abbey gardens became her solace. Her days unfolded with a deliberate stillness. In the mornings, she might sit by a narrow arched window, watching light pour into the cloister walkways, illuminating drifting dust motes like tiny golden sparks. Meals were plain bread, cheese, stewed vegetables, perhaps a little wine, but served with a quiet dignity that made their simplicity feel almost ceremonial. Afternoons often passed in conversation with the abbess or in the company of manuscripts, some of which she might have commissioned in earlier years. Though her eyesight was fading, the steady flow of words, whether read aloud or recalled from memory, kept her mind active. Fontevraud was not merely a place of retreat for Eleanor, it was a sanctuary for contemplation. Here she could reflect on the decades behind her, the whirlwind of political marriages, the bitter quarrels with her husbands, the triumphs and betrayals of her children, and the many miles she had traveled across Europe. The abbey's stillness allowed her to revisit these memories without the urgency or danger that had once surrounded them. The heated disputes of the Angevin court were now distant echoes, softened by time and perspective. At times, she must have walked through the abbey's burial grounds, where simple stone markers bore witness to generations gone before. It was here that she prepared herself for her own final rest, arranging to be laid beside King Henry II and her son Richard the Lionheart. Death, once an ever-present threat in her younger years, now seemed more like a familiar visitor whose arrival could be awaited with calm acceptance. Though the abbey was secluded, messengers and letters still reached her carrying news from the wider world. The shifting politics of France and England, the fortunes of surviving family members, and the slow changes in a realm she had once helped to shape. Even in her last years, she offered counsel, her wisdom valued by those who sought it. But unlike before, these exchanges were no longer a matter of urgency. They were the gentle advisories of someone who knew that her influence now lay not in command, but in the quiet weight of experience. The final years at Fontevraud were not defined by decline alone. They were a season of peace after a lifetime of turbulence, a rare chance for one of the medieval world's most formidable women to rest in a place of beauty and order. Within those ancient walls, surrounded by the chants of the nuns and the whispering of the wind through the cloisters, Eleanor of Aquitaine became not just a queen, not just a mother, not just a political force, but a woman at peace, carrying the sum of her memories into the stillness of her final days. The winter of 1204 settled cold and damp across the Loire Valley, its grey skies hanging low over Fontevraud Abbey. Eleanor of Aquitaine was now in her early 80s, an age few of her contemporaries could even imagine reaching. Her once bright, commanding presence had softened into something quieter, smaller in form but no less dignified. The corridors she once strode now saw her moving more slowly, leaning on the arm of a nun or the support of a cane, her steps deliberate and measured. By then, her body bore the weight of decades of travel, childbirth, and hardship. Her hands, once adorned with rings of gold and gemstones, were now thin, their skin marked by time's fine lines and the faint tremor of age. But in her gaze there still lingered the clarity of a mind that had navigated courts, crusades, and countless political storms. Even in frailty, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a queen. Those final weeks were marked by long hours spent in her private chamber, where a narrow bed stood near a small hearth. The fire's warmth could not entirely push away the chill that seeped through the abbey walls, but she drew comfort from its steady glow. A few loyal attendants, women who had served her for years, sat nearby, ready with blankets, broth, or simply the solace of quiet company. Candles burned low in iron holders, their light flickering across the pale stone walls and casting shadows that danced like the memory of her long life. Eleanor's thoughts often wandered back over the path she had walked. The girlhood in the sunlit courts of Aquitaine, her first marriage to Louis VII, and the long dusty road to the Holy Land during the Second Crusade. The whirlwind years with Henry II, full of passion, conflict, and betrayal. The rebellions of her sons, the pride she felt for Richard's courage, and the grief at his early death. The long, careful work of securing her family's power, all of it, the triumphs, the losses, the love and bitterness, drifted through her mind like a slow-moving tapestry, each thread illuminated in turn. The nuns of Fontevraud kept vigil, praying softly for her soul, as she drifted in and out of wakefulness. There was no great drama, no sudden decline. Instead, the end came like the closing of a well-worn book. One evening in early spring, Eleanor slipped into a deep, quiet sleep and did not wake. She died on April 1st, 1204, in the same abbey where she had sought peace and reflection in her final years. News of her passing spread slowly through the kingdoms she had once ruled. In an age before swift messengers and printed words, her death was marked in pockets of mourning, in the courts of France and England, in the manors and abbeys of Aquitaine, and in the memories of those who had known her as patron, queen, mother, or adversary. Her burial took place within Fontevraud's church, a place she had chosen herself. She was laid to rest beside King Henry II, the husband with whom she had shared both love and enmity, and near Richard the Lionheart, her beloved son. In death, the family that had been so often divided in life was brought together in stone and silence. Over her tomb, a finely carved effigy was placed, not of a frail old woman, but of Eleanor in the serene dignity of her prime. She is shown lying with a book in her hands, as though still reading in the eternal quiet of the abbey, her face calm, her lips closed in thought. Centuries would pass, and the political empire she helped shape would shift, splinter, and vanish. But in Fontevraud Abbey, the stone figure of Eleanor of Aquitaine would remain, a silent witness to a life that had touched nearly every corner of the medieval world. And there, in the cool stillness beneath vaulted arches and the echo of prayers, she would rest, her long journey finally ended. History often remembers Eleanor of Aquitaine in shimmering colors, a queen twice over, a powerful duchess, a woman who influenced the courts of both France and England. Paintings and romantic tales place her in gleaming halls, her robes heavy with gold thread, her head held high as poets sang in her honor. But the truth, as her long and complicated life reveals, is far more subdued, heavy, and very human. Beneath the titles and grandeur was a woman who spent years in cold stone rooms, endured the crushing weight of political expectation, and navigated the endless instability of medieval power. From her youth in Aquitaine, Eleanor had been prepared for the role of a political figure, not a free-spirited romantic heroine. Her days were measured in obligations, audiences with advisors, ceremonial appearances, exhausting journeys on muddy roads, and negotiations that often felt more like battles fought with words than swords. Marriage brought her influence but not intimacy, first with Louis VII, where their personalities clashed under the shadow of the French court's rigid piety, then with Henry II, where political partnerships soured into rivalry, leading to her imprisonment for over a decade. She saw her children grow into kings, warriors, and rebels, some dying young, others turning against each other in struggles for power. Every victory she achieved in securing a marriage alliance or calming a political crisis came at the cost of personal peace. Eleanor's later years were marked by ceaseless travel, even into her 70s, arranging alliances to hold the fractured Angevin Empire together. And when her health began to decline, she could not rely on the comfort of skilled doctors or gentle care. Medieval medicine offered little beyond herbs, rest, and prayer. Her final retreat to Fontevraud Abbey was not a dramatic exile, but rather a slow acceptance of the inevitable. That life in the medieval world was as fragile as it was long for those who survived it. She died quietly in 1204, at an age remarkable for her time. Her body placed beside Henry and Richard in the Abbey church. There was no grand parade, No sweeping gesture to mark her passing. Only the stillness of stone walls and whispered prayers of the nuns. In the end, Eleanor's story was never the polished romance later writers imagined. It was the life of a woman bound by duty, who endured loss, isolation, and the relentless demands of politics. The glitter of crowns and jewels could not disguise the truth. Hers was not a fairy tale, but the long, often lonely journey of surviving in a world where even queens had little control over their own fate. And perhaps that is what makes her story worth telling, not because it was perfect, but because it was real.